We turn now to our town meeting, and we're joined by two new panelists, and I'd like them to introduce themselves.
I'm Gale Norton. I'm Attorney General of the state of Colorado, and that means I'm responsible for the criminal appeals in our state, including death penalty cases. I was actively involved in a special session of our legislature to deal with juvenile crime issues, and my office handles the state grand jury and special prosecutions in Colorado.
I'm Bill Evers. I'm a political scientist, and I'm a scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and I'm also affiliated with the Independent Institute in Oakland, California.
Again, the rules of this portion of the program: you can ask a question, make a brief statement, and you needn't feel confined to the discussion that we have just concluded in the debate portion on crime and punishment.
I'm Dave Seaton from Winfield, Kansas. I would characterize the previous discussion as punishment now, prevention later. It seems to me that many of us live in fear of gang violence committed by young people who have neither conscience nor fear of punishment. Many expect not to live to the age of 21. How can we deter with punishment a gang member who has that attitude? And if we cannot, aren't we then faced with something like prevention now? I'd appreciate a response from someone representing both the affirmative and the negative sides in the previous argument.
From the negative, I've read a lot of studies by criminologists and sociologists who have studied youth gangs, and the consensus strongly is that the single most important factor and effective factor in moving somebody out of violent relationship with a gang is job opportunity, job training and jobs, and that's far more effective than just sending somebody to jail or prison where they're going to still have the perpetuation of the gang culture. And it would be that's why some of the most promising programs in South Central Los Angeles and other gang-infested areas where this has been tried include community outreach programs where former gang members will work together with either current or gang members or young people who are being attracted to the gangs to provide them alternative social structures, alternative communities, which is really what the gangs are for these young folks who have deteriorated families and deteriorated school environments. Give them activities, constructive activities, including school programs, after-school programs, training programs, and jobs, and that's been far more effective than sending them away to prison.
General?
One of the things that I would like to describe is the way our system currently operates. Our juvenile justice systems across the country are fairly similar. A child can be involved in 5 or 6 felony offenses before they ever receive any kind of serious punishment. I have seen rap sheets on kids with 6 felonies, and they finally get to some form of actual punishment overnight in detention. Our detention centers are places where kids go and watch television, and we wonder why there's no deterrent effect. I think if you have something that kicks in when a child commits their first crime, maybe it's a restitution program, maybe it is something like an after-school or before-school program, something that is going to cause them to have some kind of punishment or some kind of special intervention, but something that starts very early in the process, happens very quickly. And those kinds of things intervene early and send the message that crime is not the kind of thing that we ought to pursue in order for these kids to have the kinds of lives that they want.
I think the issue of gangs, street gangs, are very important. I tried to allude to it actually earlier when I suggested that in many cases the penitentiaries are also deeply influenced by gangs. But I think that you cannot separate the growth of street gangs in this country with the growth of the war on drugs. We did this once before. We created the mafia once before by our experiment, our noble experiment, so-called, with alcohol prohibition, and we are still living with the consequences 50 years later. We are currently doing it again. This is a profit-making organization, and they are fueled by the money provided by a black market in drugs. And what they offer inner-city youth are employment opportunities far more lucrative than the private market, than the free market could ever provide them.
Commissioner?
I would say that a real-world, real-time, certainly not a solution, but a way to address gang crime and a lot of other crimes and quality of life issues is community policing. It has turned into a bit of a buzz term as far as law enforcement is concerned in the late 80s and 90s. Nobody's really sure what it is, but they want to do it. We were fortunate in New York. We were able to get some additional funding, a separate funding stream in which we have increased the police force by 6,000 officers, from 25,000 officers to 31,000 police officers. Now, that translates into almost 5,000 beat officers on the streets of New York. It is not perfect, but we are doing community policing. And what it is an acknowledgement of the police working together with the community in partnership. That's not just a cliche. It actually manifests itself in a lot of different ways. You do joint problem identification, joint strategizing on how to address problems, and joint evaluation. Now, if you have a gang problem in your community, in your area, you join together with the police. You identify the problems, you identify the bad guys, and you strategize jointly on how to address it. Perhaps it is jobs, perhaps it's arrests, perhaps it's bringing in other city or governmental services to bring to bear on the problem. I think it is working in New York. Again, it's not perfect, got a long way to go, but it offers some hope for the future.
The next
Thank you.
speaker.
My name is Joseph Jennings from Palm Bay, Florida. In response to what was said a second ago in terms of the gang member, I was a gang member for a better part of my life. I was a dope addict for 14 years. I've been shot, burnt, and stabbed. I've been shot 13 different times. I think that when we talk about programs, I think we give a lot of lip service to people out in the community that are trying to get their lives in order. It's about a survival thing out there. It's about them being told they're not about anything. We drop the guns down in the community, we drop the drugs down in the community, and then we expect them to grow up to be good little boys as they turn out to be adults. And I think we need to look at a lot of different programs and figure out, are there programs that are relevant to meeting the needs of the people? You can bring in all the experts you want, and you can sit down and read all the studies you want, but until you sit down and find out what makes them tick, you guys are missing it totally. And I want to respond, my question or statement I want to make is really to Randy. I was amazed at the fact that you never really answered the young white male who asked you the question. You never really answered this question, that discussing morality, you said that discussing morality is sidestepping the issue of why we are here. How in the world can we be sidestepping the issue? We're here to listen to all different sides and whatever it might take in order to try to change people in the community, whether they're gangbangers or drug pushers. I mean, I was led to believe that perhaps you're talking about your agenda. I think we need to listen to everybody when we talk about morality. That is part of the issue. Until we change the hearts of the people, until we change the hearts of the criminal, you're never going to change them. You can send them to prison, you can give them all kind of tests and give them psychiatrists or whatever, but until you change their hearts, you're never going to change them. And you really did that guy a disservice flipping him off like that, and you shouldn't have did that.
I apologize for dismissing him if you thought that's what I was doing. I certainly didn't mean to. In fact, what I was trying to say, and I'll try to say it again, and that is that I think that we pretty much have a consensus about the morality that is about crime. I think there's a consensus about what's right and what's wrong with respect to rape and murder and all the other crimes that bring us together today. And I don't think that what's creating a crime, and this is perhaps where I simply disagree with that questioner. I'm not dismissing him, but I'm disagreeing with him. I don't think that the reason why we have a murder problem or a rape problem or a property offense problem is because some people are listening to the wrong kinds of music, or some people are spending their times in what other people think to be immoral activities of any other kind of morality. I don't think that's my view is, and this is a view about which people will differ. I don't think that's the root cause or any cause of why we have a crime problem in this country today.
I think that is part of it, though. That has to be part of it. I watched my father for years rape and molest my sister. He had no values or morals. I turned out just like my father. If my father would have had some basic values and basic morals in his life, he would have never raped or molested my sister in front of me. So on one hand, we're talking about trying to solve the problems of America, and yet we have certain people as yourself who would say, we talk about morality, but let's not talk about God. Let's not get too close to that.
But I think we're in agreement about that. I don't think that you see television shows, which I believe is what the questioner was asking me about. I don't believe you see television show glorifying raping and murdering people in front of family members. I just don't think the media is doing that. I don't think popular culture is doing that. I agree people do those things, but I think we're in agreement that those things are wrong. I think we're in agreement that that value, about that value. So in that sense, I don't believe I was dismissing him. I was trying to agree with him to that limited extent.
And if I'd like to pick up on something, the first part of your statement, because it is true in some sense. We can say, well, we all believe that life is important and taking life away is a terrible crime, a terrible sin, terribly immoral, whatever word you want to use. But you alluded to the fact that some young people in our country are brought up in surroundings and a society that make them feel as if their lives are worthless. And that means that their appreciation of life has to be somewhat different. And that's something that we have to be very, very concerned about. We are sending messages, I think particularly to young minority urban people, that their lives are not worth as much. I saw a terrible cartoon that I have never forgotten at the time of the uprisings in Los Angeles after the first Rodney King verdict. And it showed two young African-American kids on a stoop, and one of them said to the other, "What do you want to be if you grow up?" And that states the reality. If you are in a community and a situation where the reality is that you are likely not to make it to adulthood, it shouldn't be surprising that you value your own life less and those of the other people in your community less. And that's why I'd like to go a step further than Gale does when she says we have to intervene with these kids at the time of the first crime. We have to intervene with them at the beginning of their lives to make their lives valuable, to make them feel that they do have a future apart from drugs and prison and crime.
We certainly need to talk about prevention. I don't think you can talk about locking them up and killing them and doing all that stuff without talking about doing the prevention part of it. But on the other hand, I'm still saying that at some point we've got to talk about morality. The one thing that the African American has had all these years has been God, has been our faith in Jesus Christ. And I'm saying when we take away everything that we have in terms of our values and our morals, regardless of what your personal impression of Christ or anything else is, we've got certain things that for 200 years, if not been for the Bible, not been for Christ, we would have never gotten past slavery. And I'm saying leave it alone. Let those that need to have that, let them have that, if that's going to be the thing that's going to change our heart. And certainly that's part of it. Thank you.
I'm Trey Miller from Piper High School in Kansas City, Kansas. I'm here with kids voting for Kansas. And my question is directed to Ms. Nadine Strawson and perhaps all the other panel members also, if you want to interject. But how would, I noticed you brought up the probate system earlier, the probation system, and how would eliminating the probate system affect the crime rate, and when will criminals be sentenced to prison, and when will they serve out those sentences to the full term? A man named by Mr. John Diulio, Jr., is a professor at Princeton University, pointed out that the probability that a violent criminal will go to prison and serve most of his time behind bars in the U.S. is today only about 1/5 what it is in the early 1960s. And he also brought out the fact that he reported that convicted criminals spend only about 1/3 of their sentences in prison. 3 of every 4 convicted criminals are out on the streets right now.
I'm not familiar with that particular study. I do believe that we should use prison it is an appropriate sentence for certain types of offenders, particularly those who have committed violent acts. I do believe there is a role for it. I objected to using prison for non-violent offenders, and that unfortunately is something we're doing now. I think one of the reasons I'm unable to comment on those statistics is another difference between now and the 1950s or 60s, whichever period you used, is that the base sentences have increased so much so that even if people are only serving a smaller percentage of the time, the absolute number of years is still very high. We still have the highest prison terms of any country in the world, to my knowledge. And as the consensus seems to be, that has not effectively produced increased public safety. So my point is we have to look at alternatives that could be more effective in terms of community safety, could be more effective in terms of rehabilitation, and certainly could be more cost effective from the taxpayer's point of view.
Well, if you had the prisoners serve out their full sentences, though, there's another report then that shows that the average murderer spends only 1.8 years in prison. If you had those criminals serve out their full time, say it is life in sentence, without having parole or without probation periods or anything like that, wouldn't it deter crime and wouldn't it decrease these offenders from being repeat offenders?
Well, that statistic is just implausible.
8 years.
Yeah, I mean, the last Justice Department statistic showed that even for nonviolent offenses, people are serving 6 years. But the question is there a correlation between the length of time one is serving and the likelihood that one is not going to recidivate? And all the evidence I've seen, unfortunately, is that there is no correlation between longer prison terms and lack of recidivism.
I disagree with that. I think that most repeat violent offenders will keep on committing violent offenses. They have a high recidivism rate. If you keep those offenders in prison, such as a rapist, for 10 years, you are morally certain of preventing other rapes from occurring. When you release that rapist after 4 years, you are morally certain that you are condemning law-abiding citizens to being victimized by that individual. Now, I also believe that statistically, incarcerating violent offenders does reduce the crime rate. From as I said earlier, in the 60s and 70s, the prison population actually dropped in this country in absolute terms and in relative terms, while the crime rate went up 400%. It peaked in 1981. Then the incarceration rate started increasing, and during the 80s, we doubled the incarceration rate. And during that period, violent crime stopped going up. It plateaued.
But that was only true for the first half of the 80s, as I thought you yourself recognized earlier, Bill.
And then in 1987, the state started going back to the revolving door system of justice. Prison sentences were getting shorter. More people were getting put back out onto the street. And I think that anyone who suggests that we'd be better off putting those violent offenders that we locked up in the 80s back out on the street, that somehow we'd have lower crime, are being fanciful.
There also have been some studies that show a correlation between those states that incarcerate the most numbers of people over given times and the states that have the decline in the crime rate. And on the other hand, those states that incarcerate the fewest numbers of people have the most increase in the crime rate. So there are some statistics that do show that you lock people up and you make things safer. We also have statistics about the cost of having a career criminal out on the streets. And the studies have had different estimates of $350,000 to $477,000 a year. That is the amount of harm to the private sector that can be caused by a career criminal being out on the streets. And when you talk about locking somebody up at a cost of $25,000 a year, it makes sense to invest in locking those kinds of people up.
Let's proceed to the next question.
I'm Kyle Wetzel from Lawrence here. My question regards the state of the penal system in this country. All of the speakers tonight have discussed punishment in this country without really addressing the question of whether we're really punishing people by putting them in prison. I think by all accounts, most of the activity that's going out on the streets in this country, drug dealing, the gangs, racketeering, even rape and murder are happening more frequently in prison than they are out on the streets. For many of the prisoners, I think they're guaranteed 3 meals a day, recreational facilities, whatnot, and they can continue the same criminal life inside as they are outside. They're probably better off in prison, regardless of how long they're serving. No one really discussed that issue tonight, and I think that's probably a critical issue to most Americans, is whether the criminals are running our penal system or whether the state's running it. And I'd open that question up to anyone.
Bill?
I think you'd see people volunteering to go in if it were that great. So I think that your
think many
picture
of
of
them
what's
are.
wrong with prison life is right, and you're right that it would be nice to get a better handle on it, but it's very expensive. Everything you do to improve, you know, the numbers of guards you had, say, or how many people are, you know, to end overcrowding and so forth, unless you eliminate crimes, like, for example, some of the people today have recommended taking victimless crimes out of the picture, then you could make a sizable reduction in situation. But when you put somebody in there, they would rather be out. You heard Mr. Barnett depict some of the really dark side of prison life, and I think he if anything, he was being delicate in his phrasing.
It's a brutalizing atmosphere. I think as law-abiding citizens, the major question we should be asking ourselves is this the kind of environment that we want to send people to preparatory to their coming back out onto the streets? And that's the only alternative you have. This gentleman and I may disagree about how long you're putting somebody away, but with the exception of life sentencers, at some point they are coming back. And virtually the rape rate is so high within prison and correlates so strongly with those who commit rapes when they get back out. So we are schooling them to be predators. And in terms of, you know, I know there's been some politicians will talk about the country club atmosphere and how prisoners have all these rights. The United States Supreme Court has held that even if you are subject to rape or assault or other brutal mistreatment by fellow prisoners or even by guards within prison, you have no constitutional right unless you can show that it was a result of reckless indifference. In other words, even mere negligence or reckless mistreatment of prisoners, and this includes beatings, it includes rapes, are not held to violate your right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. So we are subjecting these people to cruel and unusual punishment, and you should be concerned about that, not because you might be a bleeding heart about their rights, but because you want to be concerned about what kind of monsters we're making that we're then turning loose on society again.
The next question.
Could I have a real quick follow-up? I guess no one, I mean, I'd really like someone to address the issue of how we can fix that. I mean, what you're painting is the same point I was trying to make, that our prisons seem to be a circus. I mean, I think that's the idea that most people have. How on earth are we running our prisons that it seems like a group of brutal prisoners, whether it's, you know, a majority of them or a small minority, seem to be running the system?
Yeah, I think it's an exaggeration to say that the prison systems, and I was responsible for the federal system, and I think that that is a model system. We don't have the problems that you were talking about, but I think the picture that's being painted up here is a little bit exaggerated. I think there's some bad state systems where the prisoners are in control, but there are also some very good state systems, probably the majority of them, where the authorities are in control, that do not have rape and murder within the prison system. Very rare occasion. In fact, the incidence of it in most prison systems is well below the incidence of it, you know, outside. So it's I think an exaggeration to say that they've lost control of the prison system.
Bill, would you, I hate to ask you this, but would you actually feel safe going into, not some kind of special white-collar prison facility, but into your average state penitentiary? Would you, I mean, federal penitentiary, the model system, would you feel safe in such a system if you were convicted of a crime?
Well, not me, because I was the Attorney General, so someone might not have a grudge against me. But I'll tell you.
A hypothetical person fitting your description.
Absolutely. Absolutely, in a federal system and also some of the state systems. I've been in the Texas system, for example.
Can I just say that if you've been in prisons at all, they are not pleasant places. They're certainly not the state system. They are very oppressive, and I haven't been in any state prison, and certainly a city prison, that I would want to be in for any period of time at all. But one of the problems that you bring up, I think, is underfunding as far as the correction system is concerned. The building of jails, and we see that in the crime bill now, but the politic thing to do has been to give money to the most visible arm of law enforcement, and that's the police, and to cut back on courts and corrections. So you see many corrections facilities throughout the country that are just understaffed. They just don't have enough people to do it, and it's a decision that's made politically. We're going to put money into police because that's how we're going to be shown to be tough on crime. And I think that's clearly an aspect of the crime bill that's now in conference.
Let me move to the next question.
Hello, I'm Mark Syverson. I'm from here in Lawrence. And as a libertarian, I'd like to bring up something that hasn't been touched on, and that's the problem of the growth in statism, and which could not happen without the complacency of large numbers of citizens. The current attack on property with huge levels of taxation and regulation makes it difficult for individuals to create wealth. And poor people and young people have got to look around in their communities and see how difficult it is to accumulate property and use it to make their lives better for themselves and their families. And that's one thing I'd like you to address. And the other thing is the criminalization of consensual behavior. This is done on a mass scale across the board. It's often done with the things that are least popular, the things that you wouldn't like to admit to liking in public, things like gambling, drugs, and prostitution, which nevertheless people do on a consensual basis. And as people see these civil asset forfeiture laws, which are really the type of thing that Hitler used in Germany and should not be a part of America, and it goes on, people lose respect for the law in general.
Let me address what I think is a primary point here, and that is one of the things that we were talking about earlier. Nadine mentioned that job opportunities are an important thing, and she mentioned training, alternatives in the summertime, and so forth. And a point I think you're trying to make is that there are barriers out there as government does various things that impede job creation, business creation, stop people with low skills from getting entry-level positions, and also, as Mr. Barnett has been pointing out, one of the only attractive avenues for some people with low skills are black market jobs in these artificially created black markets where government prohibitions have made ways of life very lucrative that otherwise would, earn people practically nothing, just selling some kind of pill that doesn't cost much of anything to make, or some weed or leaf that grows by the wayside here in the Midwest. It does. But you're essentially pointing out something about blockages to advancement, and they have these deprivations of liberty that you're pointing out have a flip side that's also of interest to us here, and that is the absence of individual and familial responsibility that often comes with increased dependence, the idea that the government should be the nanny or the solver of all problems, the big brother that helps us out or hurts us. A lot more has to come from communities and families and individuals and churches and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and boys clubs and campfire and things like that if this is going to be successful, because otherwise we won't have moral regeneration. We'll have a criminal devastation.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that too, if I may. I think you're absolutely right in pointing out that the very best job programs we could have, if we were really serious about creating jobs, the federal government would cut spending, government at all levels would cut spending, we'd cut taxes, we'd cut out unnecessary regulation, and we'd free up the private sector to invest and create jobs. I think it's no accident that the problem of crime has increased and gotten ever worse and more in the forefront of public consciousness as the power and majesty and sweep of government has grown at every level in this country over the last 50 years. I don't think you can disassociate that from the problem of jobs and the problems of the inner cities and the problems of the private sector in creating good opportunities for people in all walks of life.
I would just like Nadine Strawson to address the issue of the criminalization of consensual behavior and civil asset forfeiture laws.
I would like Nadine to do it in very brief compass, since we have people in line.
Bad, and we're working on both fronts to lift both with surprising allies on the civil asset forfeiture. Because so many businesses and banks and mortgage holders and people that one might ordinarily think of as conservatives and not supportive of civil liberties values are joining in coalitions with the ACLU and defense lawyers to make it much more difficult, at least, for law enforcement to seize private property without clear and convincing evidence that it's actually and directly been used in a crime.
Okay, my name's Jason Whitson. I'm from Piper High School in Kansas City, Kansas. And my question is directed towards Ms. Strawson, but I'd also welcome a comment from Judge Bowman, since this is about a statement that she made to him earlier this evening. Earlier you stated that the percentage of our prison population that consists of minority convicts is greater than the percentage of total minorities in our population. It was my understanding that you were using this to state that our criminal system was somehow racially biased.
That's only part of it. Obviously, that alone would not be enough to prove the conclusion. It's disproportionate to the crimes that they commit. If you take, for example, drug offenses, which was what I was using because we have the most complete statistics there, the percentage of blacks and whites who abuse drugs is virtually identical. And yet blacks are in prison for drug offenses in percentages far higher than whites.
Okay, I understand that, but what I was wanting to ask you, and because you didn't give any other evidence to prove that our criminal justice system was racially biased, I wanted to ask you, first of all, if you had anything else to say that would prove to us that it was racially biased.
Sure. The most comprehensive analyses have been done, because this kind of statistical comparison, as you might imagine, is very expensive. So the most detailed studies have focused on the death penalty. There was the best known study and the most exhaustive one was conducted by a man named David Baldus, who is a professor at the University of Iowa. He did a study of every single death penalty or case that where a death penalty was a possible sentence in the state of Georgia between the time that the death penalty was reinstated there in the late 1960s and when this case went to the Supreme Court, which I think was about 15 years later. Anyway, he looked at hundreds of cases and with each one controlled for hundreds of factors, looked at the seriousness of the crime, the circumstances in which it was committed, whether there was a gun involved. I think he had something like several hundred variables involved. And he found everything else being equal, you are 4.3 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim of the crime was white than if the victim of the crime was non-white. That was a basis for bringing a challenge to the death penalty in Georgia before the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court accepted that statistical evidence as showing a pattern of disparate sentencing.
What about the criminal? What was the percentage of criminals who committed the crime?
There was also a disparity in terms of the race of the criminal, but interestingly enough, the race of the victim was more significant, and that's true in studies that have been done for other crimes as well. So that those who have studied this area have concluded that our criminal justice system simply treats the lives of non-whites as being less valuable than the lives of whites, everything else being equal.
My question, though, was...
Wait.
Can I say something? I've studied this also. I had to testify on this before Congress. First, putting aside the murder study she's talking about, the place that disparity shows up is in crack cocaine distribution.
That's another one.
That is the only area where a disparity shows up, crack cocaine distribution. When you take other crimes such as robbery, rape, what have you, statistically, if percentage identified by the victims of crime, let's say victims turn out to report 20% of robberies were perpetrated by a particular group, then that statistic marches right through the system. 20% arrested, 20% prosecuted, 20% sentenced to prison in the cohort. So there doesn't appear to be any disparity outside that area of crack cocaine distribution.
Well, next question. Next question.
It seems to me that there was more or less general consensus on the scarcity of prison space and therefore the need to reserve it for the most violent offenders, therefore finding alternative methods for nonviolent offenders. It seems to me that police resources, prosecutorial resources, and judicial resources are also limited, and so wouldn't it also make sense to alleviate the rush of nonviolent offenders through that part of the system by decriminalizing these sort of offenses? I mean, don't they need the same break that the prisons do? Anybody want to answer that?
Well, nonviolent has a lot of meanings. Nonviolent has a lot of meanings. I mean, the only thing that's been advocated today, and half the people don't agree with the other half, is that some consensual crimes or victimless crimes be legalized. Now, you can say embezzlement is nonviolent. In other words, nobody's stabbed or raped or knocked out in the course of embezzlement, and it might be that you needn't imprison an embezzler in order to administer some serious corrective thing, which could be restitution, or it could be a penal thing of some other sort. But that's not to say that we want to let embezzlers go scot-free. I don't think there were any people that favored that.
Now,
but in fact, nor do I think you want.
We are over our time. I've been instructed to end the questioning, but the people in back of you have been in line, and I would like to give them the ability to ask their questions directed to someone on the panel and one response from the panel.
This was kind of, I'll direct it to the former Attorney General. The omnibus crime package, which has recently passed the House and Senate, is currently in conference. What shortcomings of that package do you see, or what positive aspects of that package do you see?
I think the solution to the crime problem in terms of strengthening the law enforcement system has to come at the state level. The federal government's jurisdiction is very small, 3 to 5% of violent crimes. So I am opposed to increasing federalization of violent street crime, and I think what we have to do is improve the state systems. Therefore, I think the general approach of looking to Washington, D.C. to deal with violent crime is exactly the wrong way to go. The changes have to occur in the state capitals. There are some good things in that bill, and most of the good things are money, but money for important things that have to be done, both on the prevention side and on strengthening the enforcement side. What concerns me is the money's coming through Washington. Washington takes the money from the states and then feeds it back, $22 billion or so to the states. I would like to see, the size of the federal government generally reduced, and I'd like to see the federal government eliminate mandates to the states, telling the states how to spend their money, and I would like to see the states have more responsibility and more resources so they could address the problems of the states.
Thank you very much. My name is David J. Roll. I'm a U.S. candidate for the Kansas 4th District Congressional District. In order for a person to understand the crime problem, one must needs go out and visit with people. So this last Friday, I went out with the police department in Wichita to the north section of town and visited a controversial area known as Plainview also. My question is directed to the scholar. My resources indicate, I like that response there.
Well, there are a lot of scholars.
My resources indicate that the federal government subsidizes gangs in the United States, specifically in California and in Texas. Therefore, can you tell me how that is going to reduce crime? And part B to that question is, what would happen if the federal government ceased those subsidies to those gangs, and what would be the worst case scenarios we could expect? Thank you. I'll sit down for the answer.
I don't know quite what, are you speaking about, for example, in the wake of the upheavals in Los Angeles, there were Crips and Bloods received various funds to do studies or to engage in more rehabilitative work or something? Is this what you're speaking about in terms of subsidies to gangs?
Go ahead.
Is that what you're speaking of? Is that an example of what you're speaking of?
Sort of, except these weren't for those sorts of things as much as they were just buy-off money to preclude further activities in those gangs in those areas. You understand? So
Well, put your
payoff
story
money.
in the newspaper. Sounds like a great story.
Okay, thank you.
You have stumped the panel.
William, Dan, Judge, what was it you said just a minute ago about releasing money so that the private sector could use it? Could you repeat that statement,
I was
please?
reinforcing the point that the questioner, I don't remember his name, I'm sorry, had made, but he had made the point that the best jobs program would be to reduce government involvement in the economy, to cut government spending, cut taxes, and cut unnecessary regulations. And if we were really serious about making our economy go, that's what we would do, and that would be the way to create jobs and opportunities for everyone. And I expressed agreement with that idea.
Well, with all due respect, I think I disagree. You seem to be...
Lots of people do.
You would be supporting...
Especially people in Washington.
Well, I would disagree with them also. You'd be supporting a system which, in which our government, as well as the private sector, combines with and does favors for the powerful in the private sector. And one example would be that we continue to construct roadways and thereby support the sale of automobiles. We're destroying our beautiful land, let us say, with traffic ways and creating opportunities for, and we're destroying our land with traffic ways, shopping malls, and such things. And these create jobs in the private sector as well as waste money in the public sector. But while we do this, we're ignoring the real work which must be done in our country, and I think this part of it you'll all agree with, in our public schools. Thousands of kids carry weapons to schools. Teachers are assaulted both verbally and physically. Students right here in Lawrence, as well as all over the country, are intimidated, are threatened, and sometimes acts are carried out against them. It seems to me that the vital work which must be done if this country is to remain a free country, we have to institute a literacy program, and we have to institute monitors or whatever it takes to make our schools safe again, and we've got to make our schools so that they actually teach children something and do whatever's necessary to achieve that goal. So that the vital work that's in this country is in the public sector.
Assume that every member of this panel agrees with what you just said.
Hear, hear.
And one of the great difficulties of running a panel like this in front of an audience that's involved as much as this audience has been involved is the time never expands to meet the amount of involvement. So I've had to rush some people along, and I apologize to them, but the mercilessness of the clock requires us to bring this to a close. So on behalf of the sponsors, I will thank our panelists for giving of themselves throughout the evening.